are starting our ecology unit, and we're going to start with lesson number 1, which is called the organization of the biosphere. So you're going to need your note taker that looks like this. Your note taker is 2 pages long, so please have this out so you can go ahead and take some notes. So here's the PowerPoint, and let's get started. So what is the study of ecology? So the first thing we need to do is define ecology. So if we put it all together, everything that's happening within our planet, we can define ecology as the study of interactions between creatures and their environment. And this is because everything is connected to everything else. So we have to keep that in mind as we study this unit. So what is the difference between each one of these ecology terms? So I'm going to let you look at these pictures for a moment and see if you can find a connection between them. So what do you see? So what is the connection that you see? Well, perhaps you see that the biosphere is a lot bigger than everything else, right? You see that the ecosystem is part of the biosphere. So inside this huge biosphere within our planet, right, the atmosphere and all of the land structures that make up our planet, we can find different ecosystems. Some ecosystems can be small, some ecosystems can be large. And then those ecosystems are comprised of community members. So within that community, you might find different species of organisms. And then if you focus on just one population within that community, you might be looking at a population of just frogs. And these are organisms that can only interbreed with each other. And then if you focus on one of those organisms within that population, then you have that individual organism or that individual member of that population. So let's go ahead and define and give an example of each terms. And these are the different levels of organization found within the biosphere. So first, let's define the biosphere. So the biosphere is the global ecosystem composed of living organisms, that's called biotic, and the abiotic, which is non-living. Factors from which they derive energy and nutrients. Earth's environmental spheres. Earth's environment includes the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere. So the biosphere is everything that contains living and non-living organisms within our planet, our beautiful planet Earth. So what is the definition of an ecosystem? Well, an ecosystem is all the interactions between the living and the non-living. So like I said before, you can have different ecosystems within the biosphere, and then how they're all related and all the interactions that they play within one another. Everything that's living and everything that's non-living, that's what we call the ecosystem. So here we see an example of a forest ecosystem with maybe a marsh ecosystem. Something as small as a log could be an ecosystem as well. So that's all the interactions that you see between what's living, which is known as the biotic factors, and what's non-living, which we call the abiotic factors. So what are some examples of living biotic factors? Well, that's everything that's living within that habitat. So those predators, those competitors, those food sources, everything that's alive. And then the abiotic factors are the non-living factors, such as temperature, moisture, air, salinity, and pH. So then we look at communities that make up ecosystems, and here we see that communities are composed of populations of organisms that interact in complex ways. So you can write that as a definition. Members of a population interact with other populations in a community. So here you see a population of lions interacting with a population of zebras and perhaps a population of might be eagles. So they compete with each other to obtain the matter and energy they need for basic resources, mates, and territory. They also cooperate to meet basic needs and carry out life processes. So here you see an example of a community in the savannah. So what is a population? Let's write down the definition of population. That's a group of interbreeding individuals that live in the same place at the same time and compete for food, water, shelter, and mates. So here we see a population of bison or a population of fish or a population of purple prairie flowers or maybe a population of white swans. So notice that they're all part of the same species. And then that means that they can interbreed and they can produce fertile offspring. All right, before we move on to the definition of an organism, let's look at a biome. Now, what is a biome? So Earth's land biomes are made up of climate and communities living in a particular area. So here you see the different biomes in our planet. And since climate determines the biome, right? Well, that climate is going to determine what the terrain and the land looks like, and also who is going to be able to live, what communities are going to be able to live within that particular biome. So keep an eye out where we are, somewhere around here. We're above the Tropic of Cancer. We are above the equator, right? So what do you think our biome is? It's got to be one of these down here. What do you think our biome is? So biomes are also known as climax communities. So this occurs when succession slows and a stable community is established. So what do you think Virginia's biome or climax community is, right? So if you look around, maybe if you look out the window, you're going to see a particular community of trees or organisms that live in the area of where we live, right? Think of the Shenandoah Valley. What kind of trees do you find there? What kind of organisms do you find there? What is our climax community, which in turn is the biome which in we live. So before we start looking at all these biomes, let's go back and let's define an organism, right? So an organism is just that one individual that lives within a group or a population group. So it's one individual that lives within a population group. Okay. Now an organism, if you want to define it even further, an organism is composed of cells, right? And an organism is alive. So an organism is biotic. Okay, so let's start looking at the different biomes here. So this is on the back of your note taker. And your task right now is to try to guess what Virginia's biome or climax community is. So do we live in a marine biome with high biodiversity? I wish, but we don't, right? So a marine biome has a high biodiversity, for example, coral reef, where there's lots of lights and lots of organisms and lots of interactions, right? Even the benthos, which is the deep ocean, you might not think of it, but there are lots of organisms that live there as well. And intertidal zones. This is kind of like where the waves break. You're going to find lots of nutrients and lots of organisms living here as well. So marine biome is an example of a biome. Tropical rainforest is another example of a biome. So perhaps you've been to a tropical rainforest in South America and Brazil, or maybe in Central America, Costa Rica. And here we find high biodiversity. We find lots of animals, lots of plants. It is always warm. because it's close to the equator. So that means that there's lots of rain and lots of sunlight. The savannah. So the savannah is also known as a tropical grassland. In this particular biome, we find dry seasons and wet seasons. It's always warm, again, because it's very close to the equator. We find frequent fires and dry seasons. We find many herbivores, and it is mid-biodiversity because of the extreme conditions, right? During the dry season, there's very little water and it's very hot. So this type of biome is pretty extreme. The desert biome, we find that is low biodiversity because, again, it's a very extreme environment. So maybe you've been to a desert here in the United States and in Arizona or in California. Here we find very dry environments. It's very hot in the day, but it can be very cold at night. We find very few plants and only small animals like reptiles, insects, rodents, and birds. And all of these animals probably need to have certain adaptations to help them conserve water because it is very dry, very little rain after all. Another example of a biome with mid-biodiversity is a temperate grassland. Don't confuse that with a tropical grassland. This is a temperate grassland, so if you think of Midwest United States, like Kansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, here we find dry seasons, wet seasons, very cold winters, and hot summers. Frequent fires in dry season because, after all, there's a lot of grasslands, and many herbivores, again, because of the type of plants that you find there. And here we have a temperate deciduous forest, very high biodiversity, very beautiful as you can see. It's got 4 seasons, warm summers with rains, cold winters with snow, deciduous forest. Deciduous trees means that these trees lose their leaves during the fall and leaves come back in the spring. Many mammals, insects, birds, etc. That's a temperate deciduous forest. And a coniferous forest, also known as a taiga. If you think of Washington State or Oregon, here we have a biome with mid-biodiversity, so northern forest, perhaps Maine, drier, cooler, lots of evergreens. These are pine trees that don't lose their needles. So they do not have leaves, they have needles instead. There's lots of mammals, birds, and insects in this type of biome. And finally, tundra. If you think of perhaps Alaska, here in the tundra we have low biodiversity because, again, we find extreme conditions like it's cold year-round, it's dry, and then you have a layer of permafrost. So here, what the layer of permafrost means that behind, under the grasses, you find a layer of frost, you find a layer of ice. Only lichen and mosses and mostly migrating animals are able to live within the tundra. Beautiful, but extreme. So, did you figure out what Virginia's biome or climax community is? So perhaps you did, right? You recognize this beautiful picture. Maybe if you've been to Shenandoah Valley and you've taken a drive, you've seen our temperate deciduous forest, our deciduous oak, hickory, hardwood forest, made up of these beautiful trees that lose their leaves in the fall. And because of that, we get to see these beautiful leaves change color in the fall because of the lack of sunlight that these trees are able to get. So we have the leaves changing color in the fall. So that's what we are. We are a temperate deciduous forest. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed your lesson 1 in ecology, and have a good day.